So, I mean, there are some methods where you can bridge kind of valuation expectation gaps. For example, or an earnout can be used. So, Bill, can you talk about bridging valuation gaps and some of the methods and mechanisms that you've used to do that between
Sure.
the expected value versus, what maybe you're getting in the marketplace?
Sure. Well, you can use an earnout, which unfortunately or fortunately has become quite often part of a transaction. We now consider that consideration as opposed to a mathematical formula that buyer and seller might use to help solve a difference of opinion on what the earnings of the company are going to be by, say, year end. So the seller might think we're going to do 5 million in earnings, and the buyer says 4 million. So you do a closing at some amount, and then you have some sort of agreement. Well, we'll true this up in a few months or at some period of time when this current year or when this period ends, and we'll make whatever adjustments based on the actual earnings. That has taken on a life of its own, where now sometimes you see these earnouts drawn out for years and years and years, which can be helpful, cannot be helpful to the seller. If there is a big difference in valuation, perhaps instead of selling all the company, maybe you sell 70% and hold on to 30% and then look to sell that at some point. Maybe you have some sort of put feature where you can put those shares back to the buyer, or maybe it's a private equity firm and they're going to sell it in 5 years, so you get the second bite of the apple, or as my friend in the UK likes to say, the second bite of the cherry. You can have stock. We had a transaction a number of years ago where it was actually a relatively small amount of cash at close, a big, huge note, which I was not a fan of, but that's what the client wanted to do. And that was sprinkled on top some stock in unfortunately, a thinly traded company on the Canadian Venture Exchange. That deal value was far higher than some of the all-cash values. That's what the client wanted. I did not recommend it. The attorneys did not recommend it. The client went with it, unfortunately, and it did not work out well. So it's kind of a cautionary tale as well. So those are some of the ideas that you might be able to structure, and you have to be very careful. Some of the other guys have said, be very careful. Does it make sense, all this structuring? Is this amount of risk that you, the seller, want to take?
Michael, any other kind of mechanisms that you see and have used in your transactions to bridge the gap between expected value and
Bill mentioned the three, an earn out, rollover equity, and a note. Those are the three primary ones. There's little tiny kind of much smaller levers. They're more about terms than anything else. Things like amount an escrow, indemnification caps, reps and warranty insurance. These are kind of, I'll say, B-level issues, but I think Bill mentioned the three that we use.
Mm-hmm. Simon, any other mechanisms that maybe you're seeing in Europe or the UK that might be a little bit different than in the North American market?
Yeah, I think they're the main ones, and it can be different if you're selling to a private company. I think you've got to look at the reason why you've got that valuation gap. If a business is just trading, very steadily, quite flat, there shouldn't be any need for it unless the owner is particularly dominant with his customers, or there's big customer dependency, and they're worried about those customers going if he leaves or sells out. So there may be occasions there that an earn out is set along customer retention rather than just pure value. But the most common one we see is, the company says tomorrow it's going to be up here, and at the point of selling it's down here. And therefore an earn out does become helpful in terms of bridging that value gap. But I think the challenges around it are making sure that you, the vendor, is in control or have some form of control in terms of the future of the business. And the conflict there with the buyer, if it's a trade buyer, is how it then integrates that business within the rest of its business, so that you can properly measure the earn out and have a target to measure it against. But I think the guys have properly articulated the key forms of earn out that we see, and the private equity one is a really good example. But not all vendors like to go with private equity because they don't. They're told by the guy down the pub or the bar, that never trust private equity because they're just asset strippers and they're going to ruin your business. So that's always a challenge. But if you can get a vendor to roll over into a private equity business, I've seen them get far much more on their stub amount of equity than they did on the first part.
I really like your point where you said, if there is a valuation gap, maybe you need to, take a few steps back and assess why is that gap there, and is there a different, kind of realization or a different kind of overview of looking at the valuation that you said at the onset to see if it's realistic. So I like that point there.